The sand of the arena was still wet with blood when Spartacus made his decision. It was a sweltering summer day in 73 BC at the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, and the Thracian warrior-turned-slave had just watched another man die for the entertainment of visiting Roman dignitaries. The deceased had been his friend, a Gaul named Crixus, who had survived 17 fights only to fall to a lucky thrust from a younger opponent. As slaves dragged the body away, leaving a dark stain in the sand, Spartacus looked around at the 70 men still alive in the barracks and spoke the words that would echo through history. "We die here for their pleasure, or we die fighting for our freedom. I choose freedom." No one knows exactly when Spartacus was born, but it was likely around 111 BC in Thrace, the wild lands north of Greece that Romans considered the edge of civilization. The Thracians were renowned warriors, serving as mercenaries across the Mediterranean world. They were horsemen and swordsmen, worshippers of Dionysus, famous for their elaborate tattoos and their refusal to submit to any foreign power. Spartacus grew up in this warrior culture, learning to ride before he could properly walk, handling weapons while other children played with toys. The Greek historian Plutarch tells us that Spartacus served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman army fighting for the very empire that would later enslave him. This detail is crucial. It means Spartacus understood Roman military tactics, knew their strengths and weaknesses, had marched with their legions and learned their discipline. Some historians speculate he might have deserted, which would explain his later enslavement, but the exact circumstances remain lost to time. What we know is that by 73 BC, this free Thracian warrior had become a slave, sold to a gladiator school in Capua, trained to die for Roman entertainment. The gladiator school of Lentulus Batiatus was a factory of death, located in Capua, about 120 miles south of Rome. It was one of the most prestigious gladiatorial schools in Italy. The building was part fortress, part prison, part training facility. High walls topped with iron spikes surrounded the complex. Guards patrolled constantly. The gladiators lived in small cells, 2 or 3 men crammed into spaces barely large enough to lie down. They were fed well. A gladiator was an expensive investment, but they were never allowed to forget they were property, not people. Training was brutal and relentless. From dawn to dusk, the gladiators practiced with wooden weapons, learning the specific fighting styles that would please the crowd. The retiarius fought with net and trident, dancing away from opponents. The murmillo carried a large shield and short sword, fighting in the style of Roman soldiers. The Thrax, like Spartacus, fought with a curved sword and small shield, representing his barbarian origins. Each style had its advantages and traditional opponents, creating a complex choreography of death that Romans found endlessly entertaining. But beneath the surface of this brutal routine, rebellion was brewing. Spartacus wasn't alone in his hatred of slavery. The school contained men from across the known world: Gauls, Germans, Syrians, Greeks, all torn from their homes and forced to kill for sport. They were united only by their chains and their desire for freedom. Spartacus began speaking quietly to other gladiators, feeling out who might join a revolt. He found eager listeners in Crixus, a Gallic warrior with a reputation for ferocity, and Enomas, another Gaul who served as a trainer in the school. The plan they hatched was born of desperation and audacity. They would seize kitchen knives during mealtime, overpower the guards, and escape into the countryside. From there, they would make for Mount Vesuvius, the volcanic mountain that dominated the Bay of Naples. It was a simple plan, almost certainly doomed to fail. But for men facing death daily in the arena, even slim odds were better than none. The breakout came sooner than planned. Someone betrayed the conspiracy to Batiatus, and word spread that the rebels would be separated and sold to different schools. It was now or never. On that fateful day in 73 BC, 200 gladiators made their move during the noon meal. The initial attack was chaos. Gladiators, armed with kitchen knives, and cooking spits against trained guards with proper weapons? Many fell in the first moments, but Spartacus and about 70 others fought their way to the school's wagon depot, where they found a cart loaded with gladiatorial weapons bound for another school. Armed now with real swords, shields, and armor, the escaped gladiators cut their way out of Capua. By pure chance, they encountered several wagons on the road carrying more gladiatorial equipment. Now properly equipped, they made for Vesuvius as planned. The Roman authorities initially treated the escape as a police matter, not a military threat. After all, these were just escaped slaves. How much trouble could 70 gladiators cause? The answer would terrify Rome for the next 2 years. Spartacus established his camp on the slopes of Vesuvius, in a position that was nearly impregnable. The mountain provided natural defenses, fresh water, and a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. More importantly, it became a beacon for every slave in southern Italy. Within weeks, the 70 escapees had become 700. Within months, thousands. Slaves fled from farms, mines, and households to join Spartacus. Not just fighting men, but women and children too, entire families seeking freedom. Rome finally recognized the threat and sent a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with 3,000 militia to end the rebellion. Glaber was confident. He bottled up the rebels on Vesuvius, blocking the only known path down the mountain. Time, he thought, would do his work for him. The rebels would starve and surrender. But Spartacus had other plans. Using vines that grew wild on the mountain, the rebels wove ladders and ropes. In the dead of night, they descended the sheer cliff face that Glaber had deemed impassable and attacked the Roman camp from behind. The militia fled in panic. Spartacus had his first real victory and, more importantly, captured a full Roman military camp's worth of equipment. This victory transformed everything. Spartacus was no longer just an escaped slave but a successful military commander who had defeated Rome. Slaves flooded to his banner. The rebellion spread like wildfire across southern Italy. By winter of 73 BC, Spartacus commanded an army of 40,000. But this created new problems. How do you feed 40,000 people? How do you turn agricultural slaves and household servants into soldiers? How do you maintain discipline among people who had known only oppression? Spartacus proved to be not just a warrior but an exceptional leader and organizer. He established a command structure, appointing Crixus and Enomos as his lieutenants. He instituted regular training, teaching former slaves to fight as a disciplined force rather than a mob. He established rules about the distribution of plunder, ensuring everyone received a fair share. Most remarkably, he prohibited rape and unnecessary violence against civilians, understanding that terrorizing the population would only unite Italy against them. The rebel army developed its own unique tactics, combining gladiatorial combat techniques with guerrilla warfare. They were more mobile than the heavy Roman legions, able to strike quickly and disappear into the countryside. They knew the terrain because they had worked it as slaves. They had intelligence from slaves, still in bondage, who provided information about Roman movements. And they had motivation. They were fighting for their freedom, while Roman soldiers were fighting for power. Through 72 BC, Spartacus won victory after victory. He defeated another praetor, Publius Varinius, capturing his horse and lictors, the ceremonial guards that symbolized Roman authority. He crushed a force led by the consul Gellius Publicola and another led by consul Lentulus Clodianus. His army swelled to perhaps 120,000 followers. For the first time since Hannibal, an enemy army roamed freely through Italy, and Rome seemed powerless to stop it. But success brought division. Crixus wanted to march on Rome itself, to burn the city that had enslaved them. Many Gauls and Germans in the army supported this idea, dreaming of plunder and revenge. Spartacus, however, had a different vision. He knew that however many battles they won, they could never defeat the full might of Rome. His plan was to march north, cross the Alps, and disperse with everyone returning to their homelands as free people. It was a practical plan, but it lacked the emotional satisfaction of destroying Rome. The division came to a head in late 72 BC. Crixus split from the main force with about 30,000 followers, mainly Gauls and Germans. They continued ravaging southern Italy while Spartacus led the main army north. The Roman Senate, now thoroughly alarmed, appointed Marcus Licinius Crassus to supreme command with 8 new legions. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, ambitious and ruthless, seeing in Spartacus an opportunity for military glory to match his wealth. Disaster struck the rebels when Crixus's separated force was cornered and destroyed by the consul Gellius at Mount Garganus. Crixus died fighting, and most of his 30,000 followers were killed or captured. Spartacus, learning of his friend's death, honored him with Roman-style funeral games, forcing 300 Roman prisoners to fight as gladiators, a bitter irony that wouldn't have been lost on anyone. Despite this setback, Spartacus continued north, and actually defeated both consular armies sent against him. The road to the Alps was open. Freedom was within reach. But then, in one of history's great mysteries, Spartacus turned back south. Why? Historians have debated this for 2 millennia. Perhaps his followers, drunk on victory, refused to leave Italy. Perhaps he learned that Germanic tribes hostile to Rome were also hostile to escaped slaves. Perhaps he simply couldn't abandon the thousands of slaves still in bondage. Whatever the reason, this decision sealed the rebellion's fate. Crassus, meanwhile, had transformed his 8 legions into an effective fighting force through brutal discipline. When one of his units fled from Spartacus, Crassus revived the ancient punishment of decimation, executing every 10th man by lot. The message was clear. His soldiers should fear him more than they feared Spartacus. He then began a patient campaign, avoiding major battles, while building a line of fortifications across the toe of Italy, trying to trap Spartacus in the southern peninsula. Spartacus attempted to escape to Sicily, negotiating with Cilician pirates to ferry his army across the strait. Sicily had a history of slave revolts, and he hoped to reignite rebellion there. But the pirates, after taking payment, betrayed him and sailed away. Trapped in southern Italy with winter approaching and supplies running low, Spartacus was forced to attempt a breakout through Crassus's fortifications. The breakout succeeded, but at heavy cost. The rebel army was now divided, exhausted, and running out of options. Some groups split off, trying to escape on their own, only to be hunted down by Crassus's lieutenants. The Senate, fearing that Crassus alone might not be enough, recalled Pompey from Spain and Lucullus from Asia Minor. Spartacus knew that when these armies arrived, all hope would be lost. In desperation, Spartacus turned to face Crassus for a final battle in 71 BC. The location was probably near the headwaters of the Sio River in southern Italy. Before the battle, Spartacus killed his own horse, declaring that if they won, he would have his choice of Roman horses, and if they lost, he would need no horse. It was a gesture worthy of the arena, dramatic, symbolic, and fatalistic. The battle was fierce and bloody. The rebels fought with the courage of the desperate, but Crassus's legions had superior discipline and equipment. Spartacus, according to Plutarch, tried to cut his way through to Crassus personally, seeking to end the war with single combat. He killed 2 centurions who stood in his way but never reached the Roman commander. Surrounded by enemies, wounded in the thigh by a spear, Spartacus fell to one knee and continued fighting until he was overwhelmed and killed. His body was never found, lost among the thousands of corpses that littered the battlefield. Of the rebel army, some 6,000 were captured alive. Crassus, in an act of calculated terror, had them all crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, one dying slave every 30 meters for 120 miles. Their bodies were left to rot as a warning to any slave who might dream of freedom. It was one of history's most horrific mass executions. Yet Spartacus's rebellion had lasting consequences. Rome never again concentrated large numbers of gladiators in single schools. The treatment of slaves, while still brutal, became somewhat less harsh as masters feared provoking another uprising. The rebellion exposed the vulnerability of an economy built on slavery, contributing to gradual changes in Roman labor practices. Most importantly, Spartacus became a symbol that transcended his own time, a symbol of resistance against oppression, of the desire for freedom that exists in every human heart. The gladiator from Thrace who died fighting for freedom has inspired countless others through history. From Hades to San Louverture to America's John Brown, slave rebels have invoked his name. In the modern era, Spartacus has become a universal symbol of resistance against tyranny. His words, as imagined by historians and artists, still resonate. "I'd rather die a free man than live as a slave." What makes Spartacus truly remarkable is not just that he rebelled, slave revolts were common in the ancient world, but that he nearly succeeded. For 2 years, he held off the might of Rome. He welded people from different cultures and backgrounds into a unified force. He showed mercy when he could have chosen vengeance. He chose the harder path of leading his people to freedom rather than the easier path of simple destruction. Though he failed, his failure was so magnificent that it became a kind of victory, inspiring others for 2,000 years. The Byzantine emperor's palace guard stood frozen in shock as Harald Sigurdsson, their captain and most trusted warrior, calmly pocketed a handful of gold coins from the imperial treasury. It was a moonless night in Constantinople in 1042, and the Norwegian giant, standing nearly 7 feet tall according to the sagas, was robbing his employer blind. But Harald wasn't just stealing, he was executing the final phase of a plan years in the making. Within hours, he would fight his way out of the greatest city in the Christian world, kidnap an imperial princess, and sail home to claim the throne of Norway. For Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler, this was just another Tuesday. Born around 1015 in Ringerike, Norway, Harald Sigurdsson entered a world of violence and opportunity. His father was Sigurd Syr, a petty king in eastern Norway, but it was his half-brother Olaf II, later Saint Olaf, who would shape young Harald's destiny. Norway in the early 11th century was a patchwork of competing kingdoms and chieftains, with Danish kings claiming overlordship and Swedish rulers meddling in Norwegian affairs. Christianity was slowly replacing the Old Norse gods, creating cultural tensions that often erupted into violence. Young Harald grew up in this chaos, learning that in the north, power came from the sword's edge and the ability to inspire men to follow you into battle. At age 15, Harald's life changed forever at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. His half-brother King Olaf had returned from exile to reclaim the Norwegian throne from the Danish-backed rulers. Harald, barely old enough to lift a sword properly, joined Olaf's army. The battle was a disaster. Olaf was killed, his army scattered, and Harald was severely wounded. As he lay bleeding on the battlefield, watching ravens descend on the corpses of his kinsmen, the teenage prince might have died unknown to history. But Rigvald Brusason, one of Olaf's loyal retainers, dragged the wounded boy from the field and spirited him away to a remote farm to recover. For months, Harald hid in eastern Norway, recovering from his wounds while Danish King Sienet's forces hunted for surviving members of Olaf's family. When he was strong enough to travel, Harald made a decision that would define his life. Instead of seeking refuge in Sweden like other Norwegian exiles, he would go east to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. The Kievan Rus, as the Viking-founded state was known, offered opportunities for ambitious warriors. Yaroslav, married to a Swedish princess, maintained a guard of Scandinavian warriors and was always fighting someone Poles, Pechenegs, Byzantines. It was the perfect training ground for an exiled prince. Harald spent 5 years in Yaroslav's service, rising to command a company of warriors and earning a reputation as a fearless and cunning fighter. He participated in Yaroslav's campaigns against the Poles, learning the Eastern European way of war, combining Viking ferocity with Slavic tactics and Byzantine strategy. But Kiev, for all its opportunities, was still a backwater compared to the real center of power and wealth in the medieval world, Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 1034, Harald led a company of 500 warriors south to Constantinople to join the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine Emperor's elite unit of Scandinavian mercenaries. The Byzantines, heirs to the Roman Empire, had learned that Northmen made excellent soldiers, brave, loyal as long as they were paid, and having no local political connections that might tempt them to palace coups. The Varangian Guard served as the emperor's personal bodyguard and shock troops, and they were paid extraordinarily well for their services. Harald arrived during the reign of Emperor Michael IV, when the Byzantine Empire was engaged in multiple conflicts. Over the next decade, Harald would fight in more battles across a wider geographical area than perhaps any warrior of his age. He campaigned in Asia Minor against Muslim emirates, crushing Seljuk Turkish raids and sacking cities along the Anatolian frontier. He sailed with the Byzantine fleet to Sicily, fighting against Norman adventurers who were carving out kingdoms in southern Italy. He participated in the reconquest of Bulgaria, bringing that ancient kingdom back under Byzantine control. But it was in the Byzantine reconquest of Sicily that Harald truly made his mark. The Byzantines were trying to retake the island from Muslim rulers who had held it for 2 centuries. Harald developed a reputation for both brilliant tactics and shocking brutality. According to his saga, he captured a well-defended town by having his men catch birds that nested in the town's thatch roofs, attaching burning wood shavings to them, and releasing them to fly home, setting the entire town ablaze. Whether this actually happened or was borrowed from other military legends, it captures Harald's reputation for cunning warfare. The sagas claim Harald participated in 18 major battles during his Byzantine service, and won them all. He accumulated vast wealth, not just from his salary but from his share of plunder. Byzantine sources, while not mentioning Harald by name, do record a particularly successful Varangian commander during this period who was known for his height, his tactical brilliance, and his insatiable greed. After each campaign, Harald would send his accumulated treasure back to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping, not trusting the Byzantine court where palace intrigue could strip a foreign mercenary of his wealth. Overnight. By 1041, Harald had risen to become the commander of the entire Varangian Guard, one of the most powerful military positions in the empire. He had direct access to the emperor, commanded the loyalty of thousands of elite warriors, and had accumulated wealth that rivaled minor kingdoms. But the Byzantine court was a dangerous place for anyone who rose too high. Emperor Michael IV died, and his nephew Michael V took the throne through palace intrigue. The new emperor, paranoid and unstable, began purging potential threats, and Harald's prominence made him a target. The crisis came in 1042 when Michael V moved against the popular Empress Zoe, sending her to a monastery. Constantinople erupted in riots. The Byzantine populace, normally passive, could be roused to terrifying violence when their beloved purple-born royalty were threatened. Harald saw his opportunity. Leading the Varangian Guard, he sided with the rioters, helping to storm the palace and capture Michael V. In one of history's more gruesome scenes, Harald personally gouged out the deposed emperor's eyes, the Byzantine method of ensuring someone could never rule again. But regime change in Byzantium was dangerous for foreign mercenaries. Zoe's new co-emperor, Constantine IX, viewed Harald with suspicion. The Norwegian had too much power, too much wealth, and too much ambition. When Harald requested permission to return home, it was denied. Then came accusations that Harald had embezzled imperial funds, that he had kept more than his share of plunder, that he had seduced a noble woman. The charges were probably trumped up, but in Byzantine politics, truth mattered less than convenience. Harald was imprisoned, but not for long. According to the sagas, He was helped to escape by a noble woman who had fallen in love with him, possibly Maria, niece of Empress Zoe. On a dark night, Harold and his loyal Varangians fought their way to the harbor. They stole to imperial galleys and faced one last obstacle, the massive chain that the Byzantines could raise across the Golden Horn to trap enemy fleets. Harold ordered his men to row at full speed toward the chain. At the last moment, he had everyone run to the stern, lifting the bow high enough to slide over the chain, then rush forward to tip the ship over and into the Bosphorus. The second galley wasn't so lucky, breaking apart on the chain, but Harold had escaped the greatest city in the world with a fortune in gold and a reputation that would echo across Europe. The journey home was itself an epic. Harold sailed through the Black Sea to Kiev, where he collected the treasure he had been sending to Yaroslav for safekeeping, a fortune so vast that it made him one of the richest men in Europe. He also married Yaroslav's daughter Elizabeth, cementing his royal credentials. Then, in 1045, he returned to Scandinavia after 15 years of exile, not as a desperate refugee but as a warrior prince with wealth, reputation, and ambition to match anyone in the north. Norway had changed in Harold's absence. His nephew Magnus the Good ruled as king, having driven out the Danish overlords. Magnus was initially suspicious of his famous uncle, but Harold's wealth and military reputation made him too dangerous to dismiss. They agreed to share the kingdom, with Harold receiving half of Norway and contributing his vast treasure to the royal coffers. When Magnus died suddenly in 1047, Harold became sole king of Norway. For the next 20 years, Harald Hardrada ruled Norway with an iron fist, earning his nickname the Hard Ruler. He fought constant wars against Denmark, raiding and burning in an attempt to recreate Sienet's North Sea Empire under Norwegian control. He built churches while still honoring the old gods in private. He patronized poets who sang of his exploits from Sicily to Jerusalem. He created the first Norwegian coinage, using his Byzantine knowledge of monetary systems. He was, in many ways, the perfect Viking king, warrior, poet, lawgiver, and politician rolled into one terrifying package. But Harald's ambitions always exceeded his grasp. The wars with Denmark dragged on inconclusively for 17 years, draining Norway's resources. His harsh rule created enemies among the Norwegian nobility. And always, he looked west to England, the richest prize in the North Sea world, where Viking kings had once ruled, and might rule again. The opportunity came in 1066. Edward the Confessor, the childless king of England, died on January 5th. The English nobility elected Harold Godwinson as king, but he faced challengers, Duke William of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the throne, and Harald Hardrada, who based his claim on an agreement between Magnus the Good and Harthacnut of Denmark that if either died childless, the other would inherit both kingdoms. It was a tenuous claim, but for a Viking warrior king, legal niceties mattered less than the strength of one sword arm. Harald assembled the largest Viking invasion force in history, 300 longships carrying perhaps 15,000 warriors. He was joined by Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of King Harold who promised that northern England would rise in support. In September 1066, this massive fleet appeared off the English coast, spreading terror like the Viking raids of old. But this wasn't a raid, this was conquest. The invasion started brilliantly. Harold landed in the Humber estuary and marched on York, the capital of northern England. At the Battle of Fulford on September 20th, he crushed the forces of the northern earls, killing thousands of English soldiers. York surrendered, and Harold, confident in victory, made a fateful decision. Instead of fortifying York and consolidating his position, he moved his army to Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of the city, to await hostages and supplies from the surrendered regions. What Harold didn't know was that Harold Godwinson had force-marched his army from London to York in just 4 days, covering 185 miles in feet of endurance that military historians still marvel at. On September 25, 1066, the English army appeared at Stamford Bridge, catching the Vikings completely by surprise. Many of Harold's men had left their armor on the ships, expecting no resistance. The day was warm, and they lounged by the river, some swimming, others sleeping in the sun. The Battle of Stamford Bridge began with one of history's great last stands. A single Viking warrior held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, killing dozens of attackers with his great axe until an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planks. With the bridge taken, the English army poured across, and the battle became a desperate struggle for survival. Harold Hardrada fought like the legendary warrior he was. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he went into a berserker rage, fighting at the front of his army, cutting down enemies with his massive sword. For hours the battle raged, with the Vikings forming a shield wall, and the English trying to break it. Then, at the climactic moment, an English arrow found its mark, striking Harold in the throat. The last great Viking warrior king fell, his blood soaking into English soil he had hoped to rule. With their king dead, the Viking army collapsed. Tostig was killed trying to rally the forces. Of the 15,000 warriors who had sailed from Norway, fewer than 2,000 survived to limp home in just 24 of the original 300 ships. Harald's son Olaf, who had remained with the ships, was allowed to sail away after swearing never to attack England again. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed in southern England. Harold Godwinson, exhausted from the battle with Harold and the forced march off, would meet his own death at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066. In a twist of historical irony, Harold Hardrada's invasion, though it failed, probably ensured William's success by weakening the English army. The Norman conquest would transform England, and eventually, the world. Harold Hardrada's death marked the end of the Viking Age. Never again would Scandinavian warriors launch major invasions of foreign kingdoms. The age of the longship and the battle-axe gave way to the age of the knight and the castle. But Harold himself represented both the culmination and the transformation of Viking culture. He was a traditional Viking warrior who had served in the most sophisticated court in Europe. He was a pagan who built churches, a raider who understood administration, a barbarian who spoke 7 languages. His life reads like an impossible adventure novel. From wounded teenager at Stiklestad to commander of the Byzantine Emperor's Guard, from exile to king, from Sicily to Stamford Bridge. He fought in more battles across a wider geographical area than perhaps any warrior before the modern era. He accumulated vast wealth, and lost it all in a single day's fighting. He represented the Viking Age's last spectacular flame before it guttered out forever. What makes Harald truly fascinating is that he was a man between worlds. He had seen the future in Constantinople's libraries and palaces, but he chose to pursue the past's glory in England's fields. He could have lived comfortably as King of Norway, but the old Viking restlessness, the need to seek fame and fortune through warfare, drove him to that fatal bridge. In the end, Harald Hardrada was both the last Viking and the first modern European adventurer, a man whose ambitions spanned continents, and whose legacy bridges historical ages. Martha Jean Canary kicked open the saloon doors of the number 10 saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota, her boots heavy with trail mud, her buckskin stained with whiskey and gunpowder residue. It was August 2, 1876, and she had just ridden 200 miles through hostile Sioux territory to deliver mail to the mining camp. The men at the bar turned to stare, not because a woman had entered. Deadwood had plenty of those, but because this woman dressed like a man, cursed like a teamster, and had just announced to the room that she'd shot 2 rogue agents on the trail and would shoot any man who didn't buy her a drink. This was Calamity Jane, and she was about to meet Wild Bill Hickok, beginning a legend that would outlive them both. Born on May 1, 1852, near Princeton, Missouri, Martha Jean Canary entered a world already tearing itself apart. Border conflicts between Missouri and Kansas were erupting into violence that presaged the Civil War. Her father, Robert Canary, was a farmer and sometimes gambler who struggled to provide for his growing family. Her mother, Charlotte, tried to maintain respectability despite their poverty, but young Martha Jane showed early signs of rejecting conventional female roles. Neighbors remembered her as a wild child who preferred climbing trees and swimming in the creek to learning needlework and cooking. The Canary family's life collapsed in 1864 when they joined a wagon train heading to Virginia City, Montana, lured by gold strike rumors. The journey was a nightmare of the type that killed thousands during westward expansion. Charlotte Canary died somewhere along the trail in Montana, probably from pneumonia. 12-year-old Martha Jane took over caring for her 5 younger siblings, while her father descended into alcoholism and gambling. When Robert died in 1867, 15-year-old Martha Jane was left entirely alone, her siblings scattered to various families who could feed them. What happened next depends on which version of Calamity Jane's story you believe, and she told many versions, each more outrageous than the last. According to her autobiography, almost certainly ghostwritten and highly embellished, she immediately began working as an Army Scout, Indian fighter, and Pony Express rider. The reality was probably far grimmer. A teenage girl alone in mining camps and frontier towns had few respectable options for survival. She likely worked as a dance hall girl, laundress, cook, and possibly prostitute, doing whatever was necessary to survive in a brutal world that consumed the weak. By 1870, Martha Jane had transformed herself into Calamity Jane, adopting men's clothing and male behavior as both protection and declaration of independence. In frontier society, a woman in a dress was either a respectable wife or a prostitute, with little room between. But a woman in buckskins who could ride, shoot, and curse, she existed outside normal categories, free from conventional expectations, but also from conventional protections. It was a dangerous freedom that Jane embraced completely. The origin of her nickname Calamity has multiple explanations, each revealing something about her character. One story claims she warned men that to offend her was to court calamity. Another says she was a calamity to herself and everyone around her. A third, perhaps most believable, suggests she was always present at calamities, fires, floods, epidemics, Indian attacks, providing help to victims with reckless disregard for her own safety. Whatever the truth, by the early 1870s, Martha Jane Canary had ceased to exist, replaced entirely by the persona of Calamity Jane. Her documented history in the 1870s places her throughout the booming frontier towns of Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota. She worked as a teamster, driving ox teams for freight companies, one of the most dangerous and grueling jobs on the frontier. She could handle a 20-mule team through mountain passes and across swollen rivers, earning the respect of men who wouldn't normally accept a woman in their ranks. She drank with them, fought with them, and outworked many of them, earning acceptance through sheer competence and audacity. The Black Hills Gold Rush of 1874 to 1876 brought Jane to the height of her notoriety. When gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, land sacred to the Sioux and supposedly protected by treaty, thousands of prospectors illegally flooded the region. The Army half-heartedly tried to keep them out while simultaneously protecting them from justifiably angry Native Americans. It was chaos, perfect for someone like Calamity Jane who thrived in disorder. She arrived in Deadwood in 1876, the wildest of the wild mining camps. Deadwood existed in a legal vacuum. It was in Indian territory, so technically no white person should have been there, meaning there was no official law enforcement, no government, no rules except what men enforced with guns. Into this anarchy rode Calamity Jane, and she fit perfectly. She gambled, drank, told outrageous stories of her exploits, and occasionally worked as a scout and messenger riding through dangerous territory that sensible people avoided. It was in Deadwood that Jane met Jane's butler, Wild Bill Hickok, already a legend from his days as a lawman in Kansas. Hickok was everything Jane wasn't: elegant, controlled, genuinely deadly with a gun rather than just boastful about it. He was also, by 1876, a man living on reputation rather than skill, his eyesight failing, his reflexes slowing, trying to make a living as a gambler rather than face another gunfight he might lose. The relationship between Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok has been debated for 150 years. Jane claimed they were lovers, even secretly married, and that she bore his child. Most historians dismiss this as fantasy. Hickok had recently married Agnes Lake, a circus owner, and his letters make no mention of Jane beyond casual acknowledgement. But something existed between them, even if it was just Jane's hero worship and Hickok's amused tolerance of the strange woman who dressed like a man and told tall tales in saloons. On August 2, 1876, Wild Bill Hickok was playing poker in Nuttall and Man's Saloon No. 10 when Jack McCall shot him in the back of the head. Hickok died instantly, his cards, 2 aces and 2 eights, forever after known as the dead man's hand, scattering across the floor. Jane claimed she captured McCall with a meat cleaver when he tried to escape, though witnesses said he was actually caught by others. What is certain is that Jane was devastated by Hickok's death. She would spend the rest of her life embellishing their relationship, creating a romance that probably never existed but that she perhaps needed to believe in. After Hickok's death, Calamity Jane's life became increasingly nomadic and chaotic. She drifted through the mining camps and frontier towns of the West: Cheyenne, Fort Laramie, Rawlins, Miles City. She worked when she could find it as a cook, laundress, nurse, occasionally as a scout for the army. Though military records of her service are sparse and contradictory, she drank heavily, often to the point of unconsciousness, waking up in jail cells or alleys with no memory of how she got there. But there was another side to Calamity Jane that her rough exterior concealed. During the smallpox epidemic that struck Deadwood in 1878, she nursed the sick with complete disregard for her own safety. The disease was highly contagious and usually fatal, and most people fled or locked themselves away. Jane went from cabin to cabin, bringing food and water to the sick, cleaning them, comforting the dying. She had no medical training, just compassion and fearlessness. Many who survived credited her with saving their lives. This pattern repeated throughout her life. When the railroad camps were struck by mountain fever, Jane was there nursing the sick. When miners were trapped by cave-ins, she joined rescue efforts. When families were burned out by fires or flooded out by spring melts, Jane appeared with food and supplies. She gave away money when she had it, which wasn't often, and would literally give someone the shirt off her back if they needed it more. This generosity, contrasted with her rough manner and wild behavior, created the paradox that was Calamity Jane. In 1885, Jane joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show briefly, one of many attempts to capitalize on her fame. But she was a disaster as a performer. She couldn't stay sober, missed performances, and fought with other cast members. Buffalo Bill, who had a genius for turning frontier characters into entertainment, couldn't manage Jane. She was too authentic, too raw, too unpredictable for the sanitized version of the West that audiences wanted. She was fired after a few months, returning to the actual frontier that was rapidly disappearing. The 1880s and 1890s saw the closing of the frontier, and Jane struggled to find her place in a changing world. The wild mining camps became respectable towns with laws and churches. The open range was fenced with barbed wire. The Native Americans were confined to reservations. The West that had created Calamity Jane was vanishing, and she was becoming a relic, a living reminder of a time that people were already beginning to romanticize. She tried to settle down multiple times. She claimed to have been married to Clinton Burke, with whom she had a daughter, though records are unclear. She definitely had at least one daughter, Jessie, who was raised by others when Jane proved incapable of conventional motherhood. The idea of Calamity Jane trying to be a respectable housewife is both tragic and comic. She would maintain sobriety and domesticity for weeks or months, then disappear on legendary benders that could last just as long. By the 1890s, Jane was making a precarious living selling photographs of herself and a pamphlet autobiography titled Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane by Herself. The autobiography is a masterpiece of exaggeration and outright fabrication, claiming she served as a scout for Custer she didn't, fought in numerous Indian battles probably not, and was secretly married to Wild Bill Hickok almost certainly false. But it sold well to tourists and Eastern readers hungry for tales of the Wild West. The Spanish-American War in 1898 briefly revived Jane's fortunes. Though in her mid-40s and alcoholic, she attempted to volunteer as an Army Scout, generating newspaper coverage. She was rejected, of course, but the publicity reminded people she was still alive. She toured the East, appearing at dime museums and giving lectures about her adventures. Audiences came expecting to see a fierce frontier woman, and instead found a middle-aged alcoholic in an ill-fitting buckskin costume, slurring through tall tales. It was pathetic and fascinating in equal measure. In 1901, Jane appeared at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, where President McKinley was assassinated. She was supposed to be a featured attraction, but spent most of her time drunk, having to be carried from saloons. She was arrested multiple times, each arrest generating newspaper coverage that emphasized how far the famous Calamity Jane had fallen. The frontier woman who had faced down road agents and nursed smallpox victims couldn't face the 20th century sober. Her final years were spent in increasing poverty and alcoholism. She drifted back to the Black Hills, drawn to the scene of her greatest notoriety. Terry, South Dakota, became her base, where she lived in a room behind a saloon, paying rent when she could, being tolerated when she couldn't. Local children remembered her as a frightening but fascinating figure, a woman who dressed like a man, swore like a soldier, and told incredible stories about the old days that might have been true or might have been whiskey dreams. In July 1903, Jane traveled to Terry, South Dakota, already seriously ill. She was suffering from inflammation of the bowels, probably caused by chronic alcoholism. On August 1, 1903, she died in the Callaway Hotel, with the hotel owner and his wife beside her. Her last coherent words were reportedly, "It's the 27th anniversary of Bill's death. Bury me beside Wild Bill." She was 51 years old, though she looked decades older, worn out by a hard life lived without compromise. Her funeral on August 4, 1903, was the largest Deadwood had ever seen. The entire town turned out along with people from across the Black Hills. The same respectable citizens who had shunned her in life mourned her in death, recognizing that something irreplaceable was being buried. She was interred beside Wild Bill Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery, united in death, as they never were in life. The conjunction of their graves would become one of Deadwood's biggest tourist attractions, cementing a romance that existed more in legend than reality. But the legend of Calamity Jane was just beginning. Within months of her death, dime novels featuring her adventures were flooding the market. She became a character in countless Western films, played by everyone from Jean Arthur to Doris Day to Robin Weigert. Each portrayal moved further from the historical Martha Jane Canary, creating a mythical figure that bore little resemblance to the complex, troubled woman who had lived and died on the frontier. The real Calamity Jane was neither the gunslinging hellcat of dime novels nor the hearts of gold prostitute of Hollywood westerns. She was a woman who refused to accept the limitations her society placed on her gender, choosing freedom over respectability, adventure over security. She paid a terrible price for that choice: alcoholism, poverty, loneliness. But she lived on her own terms in a way few women of her era could imagine. What makes Calamity Jane significant is not her exaggerated exploits, but what she represented. She was one of the first women in American history to completely reject female gender roles, not by fighting for women's rights, but by simply living as if those restrictions didn't exist. She dressed like a man, worked men's jobs, drank in men's spaces, and demanded to be treated as an equal. She was a frontier feminist who probably never heard the word feminism. Her compassion for the suffering, shown repeatedly throughout her life, reveals the complexity beneath the rough exterior. The woman who could outdrink and outcurse any teamster was the same woman who risked her life nursing smallpox victims. The notorious hellraiser who shot up saloons was the same person who gave away her last dollar to someone in greater need. She contained multitudes, defying easy categorization. Calamity Jane also represents the dark side of the frontier myth. The freedom and opportunity of the West came with violence, alcoholism, and early death. The sane lawlessness that allowed her to reinvent herself also left her without protection or support systems. The frontier that created her legend also destroyed her body and possibly her mind. She was both beneficiary and victim of the Wild West. In the end, Martha Jane Canary created Calamity Jane as a survival mechanism that became a prison. The persona that freed her from conventional expectations also trapped her in a role that became harder to maintain as she aged. She couldn't stop being Calamity Jane because that was all she had, all she was. The performance became the person. The legend consumed the life. Her grave in Deadwood is still visited by thousands each year, people drawn to the myth more than the history. They leave whiskey bottles and poker chips, tributes to a legend that never quite existed. But perhaps that's appropriate. Calamity Jane was always more story than fact, more performance than person. She lived her life as a tall tale, and in death she became one permanently. 3 extraordinary lives from different centuries, different continents, different worlds, yet Spartacus, Harold Hardrada, and Calamity Jane share a common thread that weaves through the tapestry of Western history. Each refused to accept the role that fate had assigned them. Each shows rebellion over resignation, adventure over acceptance, freedom over safety. They were people who looked at the boundaries of their worlds and decided to cross them, no matter the cost. Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator, refused to accept that his destiny was to die for Roman entertainment. In a world built on slavery, where human beings were property to be bought, sold, and discarded, he stood up and said no. His rebellion lasted only 2 years, but those 2 years shook the foundations of the mightiest empire on earth. He showed that the oppressed could organize, could fight, could win victories against seemingly impossible odds. Though he died defeated, his defeat was so magnificent that it became a victory for the human spirit. Every revolution since has carried something of Spartacus within it. The idea that freedom is worth dying for, that dignity cannot be permanently suppressed, that even slaves can make empires tremble. Harold Hardrada lived in an age when the world was expanding, when a warrior with enough courage and cunning could carve out a kingdom with his sword. He traveled further than perhaps any warrior of his age, from Norway to Kiev to Constantinople to Sicily to England. He served emperors and became a king. He accumulated vast wealth and lost it all in a single day. He represented both the culmination of the Viking Age and its end, a man who had seen the future in Byzantine libraries, but chose to pursue glory in the old way. His death at Stamford Bridge marked the end of an era, but his life showed that individuals could transcend their origins through sheer will and martial prowess. He proved that exile could become opportunity, that a defeated prince could become a victorious king, that the world was vast enough for the ambitious to write their own stories. Calamity Jane lived on the edge of civilization, in a brief moment when the American frontier allowed people to completely reinvent themselves. She rejected every convention of female behavior in the 19th century, choosing to live as freely as any man. She drank, fought, swore, and worked alongside men who gradually accepted her as an equal. She paid a terrible price for her freedom, alcoholism, poverty, loneliness, but she never surrendered her independence. In a time when women had few rights and fewer opportunities, she created her own identity through sheer force of personality. She was a walking rebellion against gender norms, a frontier original who showed that women could be as wild, free, and dangerous as any man. These three figures also embody the violence and tragedy that often accompanies rebellion. Spartacus saw his army of freed slaves destroyed, 6,000 of them crucified along the Appian Way. Harald died with an arrow in his throat, his army annihilated, his dreams of conquest ended in a few hours of brutal combat. Jean drank herself to death, her body broken by the hard life she had chosen, dying in a cheap hotel room far from anywhere that mattered. Their stories are not simply triumphant tales of human freedom, but complex narratives of ambition, violence, suffering, and loss. Yet we remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived. They refused to be statistics, to be forgotten, to accept the limitations that their worlds tried to impose. They demanded more from life than life wanted to give them. They were unreasonable, impossible, dangerous people who changed the course of history through their refusal to comply with history's plans for them. In our modern age, when we face our own boundaries and limitations, these three rebels speak to us across the centuries. Spartacus tells us that no system of oppression is permanent, that human dignity will always reassert itself, that even the mightiest empire can be challenged by those it considers beneath notice. Harald reminds us that the world is vast and full of opportunities for those brave enough to seize them, that exile can become adventure, that failure in one place can become success in another. Jean shows us that identity is something we create, not something imposed upon us, that freedom is possible even in the most restrictive circumstances if we're willing to pay the price. They also warn us about the cost of rebellion. Freedom is not free, it demands sacrifice, often of everything we hold dear. The path of the rebel is lonely, dangerous, and often ends in tragedy. But for some people, in some circumstances, that price is worth paying. For Spartacus, Harald, and Jean, a single day of freedom was worth more than a lifetime of servitude. These were not perfect people, far from it. Spartacus led thousands to their deaths in a doomed rebellion. Harald was a violent warlord who brought death and destruction wherever he went. Jean was an alcoholic whose self-destructive behavior hurt everyone who tried to help her. But their imperfections make their achievements more remarkable, not less. They were human beings, flawed and complex, who nonetheless managed to transcend their circumstances and become legends. The world they lived in was arguably harder than ours, more violent, more restrictive, with fewer opportunities and harsher consequences for failure. Yet they found ways to rebel, to adventure, to live freely. If they could do it in ancient Rome, medieval Scandinavia, and the American frontier, what excuse do we have in our modern world with all its freedoms and opportunities? Their message echoes across time. You are not trapped by your circumstances. You are not defined by others' expectations. You are not limited to the role society assigns you. You can choose rebellion over resignation, adventure over acceptance, freedom over safety. The price may be high, it was for them, but the alternative is to live and die without ever really living at all. Spartacus died on a battlefield, fighting for freedom. Harald died at a bridge, reaching for a crown. Jane died in a hotel room, still dressed in the buckskins that declared her independence. None of them died in bed, old and comfortable and safe, but they lived, truly lived, in ways that most people never dare to attempt. They burned bright and burned out, leaving behind legends that have lasted millennia, in Spartacus's case, centuries for Harald and Jean. So the question they pose to us across the ages is simple but profound. Will you accept the life that others have planned for you, or will you rebel and create your own? Will you stay safely within boundaries, Or will you cross them to see what lies beyond? Will you be forgotten? Or will you live in such a way that centuries from now people will still speak your name? The choice, as it was for Spartacus facing the arena's sand, for Harold seeing Constantinople's walls, for Jane donning men's clothing for the first time, is yours. History is waiting to see what you'll do with it. These three rebels, raiders, and renegades didn't wait for permission to be extraordinary. They took their freedom, seized their opportunities, created their legends through acts of will that still inspire us today. They were impossibly brave, probably crazy, definitely dangerous. They were also magnificently, eternally, inspiringly human. And that's the final lesson of their lives, that ordinary people, when they refuse to remain ordinary, can shake empires, conquer kingdoms, and redefine what's possible. You don't need to be born special. Spartacus was a slave. Harold was an exile. Jane was an orphan. They became special through their choices, their actions, their refusal to accept no as an answer. If this journey through the lives of history's greatest rebels has fired up your spirit, smash that like button, and let me know in the comments. Which of these three legendary figures would you want to meet? Would it be Spartacus the gladiator general, Harold the Viking king, or Calamity Jane the frontier legend? And remember, we're just scratching the surface of history's incredible stories. Next week, we're diving into three more lives that defied the impossible and changed the world forever. Hit subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a single adventure through time. Until then, remember what these three rebels taught us. History isn't made by those who follow the rules. It's made by those brave enough, crazy enough, or desperate enough to break them. The question is, which one are you?